So we're in Kyiv now. Please tell me, who are you? What are you doing here?
My name is Michael Washura. I'm a journalist with Newsweek USA. I've been working for them since March of this year, shortly after the war started.
You told me that you've been in Moscow just a few days before the war.
And
Why?
for several years before the war.
Okay, please tell me more about this.
So I worked as a freelancer in Moscow for several years before the war started, before leaving on February 23rd of this year.
I understood that you had some discussions with the officials and other journalists there, and almost what were their thoughts before the war?
For maybe 6 weeks before the invasion actually occurred, I was fairly certain that it was going to happen. There was an interesting dynamic where almost every subject matter expert in the United States, subject matter being Russia, thought that no invasion was going to happen. And almost every journalist who had really good sources in Washington in national security circles were sure that it was going to happen. I don't want to praise myself too much, but I was kind of unique among Western journalists in Moscow who believed that there really was going to be an invasion. The reason why I think most of my colleagues didn't expect an invasion was because most of the people in Russia who they would go to for information, a lot of times insiders in Moscow, these people weren't aware that it was going to happen. And they didn't expect that it was going to happen. They legitimately believed that this was some sort of Western intelligence information operation aimed against Russia. And that's what they told journalists who spoke to them on a regular basis. When I would ask these people a few more questions, the narrative which they were saying was true didn't really hold together. Very often they would say that the 150,000 Russian troops surrounding Ukraine, they were there as part of sort of an effort at coercive diplomacy. But when you would ask them coercive diplomacy to what end, they would talk about these treaties, which the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out in December of 2020, 2021, I guess. What year are we in? 2020, demanding a few achievable goals, such as new arms control talks, but then several unachievable goals, like rolling back NATO infrastructure to 1997 borders. In January and February, as the Russian invasion force grew, a lot of insiders in Moscow still insisted that this was only an attempt to get the West to agree to these terms, when everybody, including people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia, understood that getting NATO borders moved back to where they were in 1997 wasn't going to happen. Getting infrastructure moved back to those borders wasn't going to happen. And so, this growing invasion force was essentially there for no discernible purpose unless it was to invade Ukraine.
And many of the troops were in Belarus. There were some military exercises. They pretended.
They said that they were military exercises.
Yeah.
And so when they were sending more and more troops in order to actually be near the equipment which had been transported before the troops were sent, when they sent the troops, they said it was for the purpose of military exercises, snap exercises, which wasn't plausible, especially given the fact that due to Russia's growing invasion force on the borders with Ukraine, European customers of Russian oil and gas were already looking at not opening up Nord Stream 2, re-examining their trade relationship with Russia. This supposed effort at coercive diplomacy was starting to cost Russia a lot of money. It didn't make any sense as a diplomatic venture. It didn't make any sense as an economic venture. It didn't make any sense unless Russia was actually preparing to invade Ukraine. And among a few of the security people in Moscow, there was the understanding that this was going forward, even if the diplomats didn't know, even if the business people didn't know. People around the security structures would say things like, trust us, people who know what they are doing are keeping everything under control. These same people would often tell me that if an invasion were to happen, in the opening hours, 70% of Ukrainian officers would go over to the Russian side within the first few hours. And having lived in Ukraine for quite a while, I lived in Ukraine for 3 years, I lived in Russia for nearly 8. But I knew Ukraine and I knew Ukrainians much better than everyone who I knew in Moscow did. The degree to which people around the Kremlin simply did not and still do not understand Ukraine is, I shouldn't say shocking because it shouldn't shock me anymore, but it still sometimes surprises me how resistant they are to evidence of the fact that they don't understand this country. They did not expect Ukrainians to come together. They did not expect Ukrainians to fight back. They did not expect the Ukrainian army to actually remain loyal to the government in Kiev. And they were wrong. And they wouldn't listen to any evidence suggesting that they were wrong.
And how can you explain the fact that in Moscow, before the war, all of the voices, officials and journalists thought that Russia will not invade Ukraine? Do you think it was a very good action of disinformation, or the Kremlin itself lied everyone below them?
That's a really good question, because one of the aspects that a lot of Western journalists and also liberal Russian journalists pointed to in the run-up to the war was that there was not a coordinated propaganda campaign preparing ordinary Russians for war. A lot of people would point to the fact that in 2014, after Russian soldiers, kind of undercover but under very poor cover, started invading the Donbass region. This is after the annexation of Crimea. Russia sent further volunteers into eastern Ukraine. Russian state propaganda put out a lot of very rabid, very unbelievable stories about what was happening in Ukraine, about Nazis, about Ukrainian troops crucifying a Russian-speaking boy in the Donbass. And so in 2022, in January and February, when Western and also local Russian, more liberal journalists didn't see those kinds of stories in the media, they concluded that there was no propaganda campaign. These people were not watching Russian daytime and evening television, because every afternoon and evening for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, there would be debates where Russian experts were brought into a studio and were talking about Ukrainian Nazis. We're talking about how NATO, specifically the UK, was planning a chemical attack in the Donbass, which they would then blame on Russia and use as a kind of provocation to then go and attack the Donbass themselves. In the run-up to the actual invasion, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs claimed there were 250,000 Ukrainian troops preparing to attack the Donbass, to start this war, and that Russia was going to need to act in self-defense. And anybody who was watching the television shows that ordinary Russians watch was seeing this. Most Western journalists and most liberal Russian journalists did not watch these shows and did not see this propaganda campaign, which was preparing the population right in front of their eyes.
After the war started in 24th of February this year, did you keep contact with some of your friends, connections, journalists in Moscow? And
Yes.
you keep the conversation, look what you thought and what happened?
Yes. So I know a lot of people in a lot of different circles in Moscow. I know some liberals, and a lot of them admitted that we didn't see this coming. We were always against Putin, but even we didn't realize how terrible he was. That's a pretty small minority of the population, but it does exist. Being there, I had a lot of conversations with people who had been saying for years that Russia should attack Ukraine. In the run-up to the invasion, some of these people thought it was going to happen. Most of them did not. But now that it has, and even though it has gone very poorly from a Russian perspective, they are all still fully confident that Russia is going to win this war. One of the dynamics of a conflict is that it's the side that's losing, which often determines when the war ends, because it doesn't end until they either can't continue fighting or won't continue fighting. And there's no indication, talking to these people, that Russia is going to stop fighting anytime soon. So yeah, I'm still in contact with people, and they are as crazy as they were on February 23rd.
So they think that Russia will win on the field?
Yeah, they believe that the West is going to collapse, that Western support for Ukraine will collapse this winter when, and this is their prognosis, when Ukrainians themselves come out onto the streets to demand that their fascist government stops freezing them. They really believe that when there's no electricity here, ordinary Ukrainians are going to turn against the Zelensky government and demand that Ukraine make peace with Russia. They believe that. And they believe that when that happens, Western support, military support for Ukraine will stop.
And they think that they need to use nuclear weapons or chemical weapons to win, or not?
They don't believe they need to use nuclear or chemical weapons to win, which is why when eventually their prognosis about how this campaign goes, this electrical energy infrastructure campaign, will fail. The same way that their campaign to take Kiev in the spring failed. The same way their campaign to take Odessa through Kherson and Mykolaiv failed. This electrical energy infrastructure campaign will fail, and at some point maybe they will start thinking about nuclear or chemical weapons. But at this point they're not. They still believe they can win this war conventionally.